Chapter 6. Charter Magic on the Cloven Crest. It was like a scent of the wind. It was like a scent on the wind to the thing that lurked in the caverns below the hill, some mile or more to the west of the broken Charterstone. It had been human once, or human-like, at least. In the years it had lived under the sun, that humanity had been lost in the centuries the thing spent in the chill waters of death, ferociously holding its own against the current, demonstrating an incredible will to live again, a will it didn't know it possessed before a badly cast hunting spear bounced from a rock and clipped its throat. Just enough for a last few minutes of frantic life. By sheer effort of will, it had held itself on the life side of the fourth gate for 300 years, growing in power, learning the ways of the dead. It preyed on lesser spirits and served or avoided greater ones. Always the thing held on to life. Its chance finally came when a mighty spirit erupted from beyond the seventh gate, smashing through each of the upper gates in turn, until it went raving into life. Hundreds of the dead had followed, and this particular spirit had joined the throng. There had been terrible confusion, and the mighty enemy at the very border between life and death, but in the melee, it had managed to sneak around the edges and squirm triumphantly into life. There were plenty of recalled, vacated bodies where it emerged, so the thing occupied one, animated it, and ran away. Soon after, it found the caves it now inhabited. It even decided to give itself a name, Thralk. A simple name, not too difficult, for a partially decomposed mouth to voice. A male name. Thralk couldn't remember what its original sex had been centuries before, but its new body was male. It was a name to instill fear in the few small settlements that still existed in the area of the borderlands. Settlements Thralk preyed upon, capturing and consuming the human life he needed to keep himself on the living side of death. Charter magic flared over the cloven crest again, and Thralk sensed it was a strong and pure but weakly cast. The strength of the magic scared him, but the lack of skill behind it was reassuring, and the strong magic meant a strong life. Thralk needed that life, needed it to shore up the body he used, needed it to replenish the leakage of his spirit back into death. Greed won over fear. The dead thing left the mouth of the cave, and started climbing the hill, his lidless, rotting eyes fixed on the distant crest. Sabriel saw her guide. Sabriel saw her guide, first as a tall, pale light drifting over the swirling water towards her, and then, as it stopped several yards away, as a blurred, glowing human shape, its arms outstretched in welcome. Sabriel. The words were fuzzy and seemed to come from much farther away than where the shining figure stood. But Sabriel smiled as she felt the warmth in the greeting. Abhorsen had never explained who or what this luminous person was, but Sabriel thought she knew. She'd summoned this advisor only once before, when she had first menstruated. There was minimal sex education at Waverly College, none at all till you were 15. The older girls' stories about menstruation were many and varied, to often meant to scare. None of Sabriel's friends had reached puberty before her, so in fear of desperation she had entered death. Her father had told her that the paper boat summoned would answer any question and would protect her, and so it had. The glowing spirit answered all her questions, and many more besides, till Sabriel was forced to return to life. "Hello, mother," said Sabriel, sheathing her sword, carefully muffling Sereneth with her fingers inside the bell. The shining shape didn't answer, but that wasn't unexpected. Apart from her one-word greeting, she could only answer questions. Sabriel wasn't really sure if the manifestation was the only unusual dead spirit of her mother, which was unlikely, or some residual protective magic left by her. "I don't have much time," Sabriel continued. "I'd love to ask you about, everything, I guess. But at the moment, I need to know how to get to Father's house in Clovencrest. I mean, Barhedrian Ridge." The sending nodded and spoke as Sabriel listened. She also saw pictures in her head of what the woman was describing, vivid images like memories of a journey she'd taken herself. "Now go northern side of the ridge. Follow the spur that begins there down till it reaches the valley floor. Look at the sky. There won't be any cloud. Look at the brightest red star, Eualis, near the horizon, 3 fingers east of the north. Follow that star till you come to a road that runs from southwest to northeast. Take that road for a mile to the northeast till you reach a mile marker in the center stone behind it. A path behind the stone leads to a long cliffs immediately north. Take the path. It ends in a door in the cliffs. The door will be answered to Masriel. The door will answer to Masriel. Beyond the door is a tunnel, sloping sharply upwards. Beyond the tunnel lies Abhorson's bridge. The house is over the bridge. Go with love, and do not tarry. Do not stop, no matter what happens." "Thank you," Sabriel began, carefully filing the words away with the accompanying thoughts. "Could you also—" She stopped, as the mother sending in front of her suddenly raised both arms as if in shock and shouted, "Go!" At the same time, Sabriel felt the diamond of the protection around her physical body twinge in warning, and she became aware that the north mark had failed. Instantly, she turned on her left heel and began racing back to the border with life, drawing her sword. The current almost seemed to strengthen against her, twining around her legs, but then fell away before her urgency. Sabriel reached the border, and, with a furious thrust of will, her spirit emerged back into life. For a second, she was disoriented, suddenly freezing again, and thick-witted. A grinning, corpse-like creature was just stepping through the failed north mark, its arms reaching to embrace her, carrion breath misting out of a mouth unnaturally wide. Thralk had been pleased to find the Charter Mage's spirit wandering and the broken diamond of protection. The sword had worried him a little, but it was frosted over, and his shriveled eyes couldn't see the charter marks that danced beneath the rime. Similarly, the bell that Sabriel's left hand looked like a lump of ice or snow, as if she had caught a snowball. All in all, Throck felt very fortunate, particularly as the life that blazed within this still victim, was particularly young and strong. Throck sidled closer still, and his double-jointed arms reached to embrace Sabriel's neck. Just as his slimy, corrupted fingers stretched forward, Sabriel opened her eyes and executed a stop thrust that had earned her second place in fighting arts, and later lost her the first. Her arm and sword straightened like one limb to their full extent, and the sword pointed ripped through Throck's neck and into 8 inches of air beyond. Throck screamed and reached, and his reaching fingers gripping the sword to push himself free, only to scream again as the charter marks flared on the blade. White hot sparks plumed against his knuckles, and Throck suddenly knew what he had encountered. "Abhorsen!" he croaked, falling backwards as Sabriel twisted the blade free with one explosive jerk. Already the sword had affected the dead flesh Throck inhabited. Charter magic burned through reanimated nerves, freezing those all too fluent joints. Fire rose in Throck's throat, but he spoke, a distant to distract this terrible opponent while his spirit tried to shuck the body like a snake its skin and retreat into the night. "Abhorsen, I will serve you, praise you, be your hand. I know things alive and dead. I will help lure others to you." The clear, deep sound of Sereneth cut through the whining, broken voice, just like a foghorn, booming above the shriek of seagulls. The chime vibrated on, echoing into the night, and Throck felt it bind him, even as his spirit leaked out of the body and made for flight. The bell bound him to paralyzed flesh, bound him to the will of the bell ringer. Fury seethed in him. Anger and fear fueling his struggle. But the sound was everywhere, all around him, all through him. He would never be free of it. Sabriel, watching the misshapen shadow writhing, half out of the corpse, half in, the body bleeding a pool of darkness. It was still trying to use its corpse's mouth, but without success. She considered going into death, where it would have a shape, and she could make it answer to Direm. But the broken charter stone loomed nearby, and she felt it as an ever-present fear, like a cold jewel beyond her breast. In her mind, she heard her mother Sending's words, "Do not tarry, do not stop, no matter what happens." Sabriel thrust her sword point first into the snow, put Sereneth away, and drew Kebeth from the bandolier, using both hands. Throck sensed it, and his fury gave way to pure, unadulterated fear. After all the centuries of struggle, he knew true death had come for him at last. Sabriel took up a careful stance, with the bell held in a curious two-handed grip. Kebeth seemed almost to twitch in her hands, but she controlled it, swinging it backwards, forwards, and then in a sort of odd figure 8. The sounds, all from the one bell, were very different to each other, but they made a little marching tune, a dancing song, a parade. Throg heard them and felt forces grip him, strange, inexpressible, extortable? Yeah. Strange, extortable powers that made him find the border, made him return to death. Vainly, almost pathetically, he struggled against them, knowing he wouldn't break free. He knew that he could walk through every gate to fall at last through the ninth. He gave up the struggle and used the last of his strength to form a syllabus of a mouth in the middle of his shadow stuff, a mouth with a writhing tongue of darkness. "Curse you," he gurgled. "I will tell the servants of Carrigor. I will be revenged." His grotesque, gulping voice was chopped off in mid-sentence, as Throck lost free will. Sereneth had bound him, but Kiribeth gripped him, and Kebeth gripped him, and Kebeth walked him so Throck would be no more. The twisting shadow simply disappeared, and there was only snow under a long dead corpse. Even though the revenant was gone, his last words troubled Sabriel. The name, Carrigor, while not exactly familiar, touched some basic fear in her, some memory. Perhaps Abhorsen had spoken this name, which undoubtedly belonged to one of the greater dead. Excuse me. The name scared her in the way the broken stone did. If they were tangible symbols of a world gone wrong, a world where her father was lost, where she herself was terribly threatened. Sabriel coughed, feeling the cold in her lungs, and very carefully replaced Kebeth in the bandolier. Her sword seemed to have burned itself clean, but she ran the cloth over the blade before returning it to its scabbard. She felt very tired as she swung her pack back on. But there was no doubt in her mind that she must move on immediately. Her mother spirit's words kept echoing in her mind, and her own senses told her something was happening in death, something powerful to move towards life, moving towards the emergence at the broken stone. There had been too much death and too much charter on this hill, and the night was yet to reach its blackest. The wind was swinging around, the clouds regaining their superiority over sky. Soon the stars would disappear, and the young moon would be wrapped in white. Quickly, Sabriel scanned the heavens, looking for the 3 bright stars that marked the buckle of the North Giant's belt. She found them, but then had to check the star map in her almanac, a handmade match stinking as it cast a yellow flicker to the pages. She didn't dare use any more charter magic till she was away from the broken stone. The almanac showed that she had remembered correctly. The buckle was due north in the Old Kingdom. Its other name was Mariner's Cheat. In Ancelstier, the buckle was easily 10 degrees west of north. North located, Sabriel started to make her way to that side of the crest, looking for the spur that slanted down to the lost valley in darkness below. The clouds were thickening, and she wanted to reach level ground before the moonlight disappeared. At least the spur, when found, looked like easier going than the broken steps to the south, though its gentle slope proclaimed a long descent to the valley. In fact, it took several hours before Sabriel reached the valley floor. Stumbling and shivering, a very pale charter flame dancing a little ways in front of her. Too insubstantial to really ease her path, it had helped her avoid major disaster, and she hoped it was paled enough to be taken for marsh gas or chance reflection. In any case, it was proven essential when clouds closed and the last remaining gap in the sky. So much for no clouds, Sabriel thought, as she looked towards what she guessed was still north, reaching for the red star, Euleus. Her teeth were chattering and would not be stilled, and the shiver that had started with her ice-cold feet was repeating itself through every limb. If she didn't keep moving, she'd simply freeze where she stood, particularly as the wind was rising once more. Sabriel laughed quietly, almost hysterically, and turned her face to feel the breeze. It was an easterly, gaining strength with the minute. Colder, yes, but it also cleared the cloud, sweeping it from the sky to the west, and there, in the first cleared broom stroke of the wind, was Euleus, gleaming red. Sabriel smiled, stared at it, took stock of the little she could around it, and started off again, following the star, a whispering voice constant in the back of her mind. Do not tarry, do not stop, no matter what happens. The smile lasted as Sabriel found the road, and with a good cover of snow in each gutter, she skied, making good time. By the time Sabriel found the mile marker and the Charterstone behind it, no trace of the smile could be seen on her pale face. It was snowing again, snowing sideways as the wind grew more frenzied, taking the snowflakes and whipping them into her eyes, now the only exposed portion of her entire body. Her boots were soaked too, despite the mutton fat she had rubbed into them. Her feet, face, and hands were freezing, and she was exhausted. She'd dutifully eaten a little every hour, but now simply couldn't open her frozen jaws. For a short time, at the intact Charterstone that rose proudly beyond the small mile marker, Sabriel had made herself warm, invoking the charter spell for heat, but she'd grown too tired to maintain it without the assistance of the stone, and the spell dissipated almost as soon as she walked on. Only the mother spirit's warning kept her going, that and the sensation that was being followed was only a feeling, and in her tired, chilled state, Sabriel wondered if it was just imagination. But she wasn't in any state to face up to anything that might not be imagined, so she forced herself on. Do not tarry. Do not stop, no matter what happens. The path from the Charterstone was better made than the one that climbed Cloven Crest, but steeper. The pathmaker that here had to cut through a dense grayish rock which did not erode like granite, and they had built hundreds of wide, low steps carved with intricate patterns. Whether these meant something, Sabriel didn't know. They weren't charter marks or symbols of any language that she knew, and she was too tired to speculate. She concentrated on one step at a time, using her hands to push down on her aching thighs, coughing, gasping, head down to avoid the flying snow. The path grew steeper still, and Sabriel could see the cliff face ahead, a huge black vertical mass, a much darker backdrop to a swirling snow than a clouded sky, palely backlit by the moon. But she didn't seem to get any closer, as if the path switched back to and fro, rising further and further up from the valley below. Then, suddenly, Sabriel was there. The path turned again, and her little will-o'-the-wisp light reflected back from the wall, a wall that stretched for miles on either side, and for hundreds of yards upwards. Clearly, these were the long cliffs, and the path had ended. Almost sobbing with relief, Sabriel pushed herself forward to the very base of the cliff, and the little gray light rose above her head to disclose gray. Lichen-veined rock. But even with that light, there was no sign of a door, nothing but jagged impervious rock going up and out from the tiny circle of illumination. There was no path and nowhere else to go. Wearily, Sabriel knelt in the patch of snow and rubbed her hands together vigorously, trying to restore circulation before drawing Sabriel from the bandolier. Sabriel, the waker, Sabriel stilled it carefully and concentrated her senses, feeling for anything dead that might be near or should not be woken. There was nothing close, but once again Sabriel felt something behind her, something following her, far down on the path, something dead, something reeking of power. She tried to judge how distant the thing was before forcing it from her thoughts. Whatever it might be, it was too far away to hear even Sabriel's raucous voice. Sabriel stood up and rang the bell. It made a sound like tens of parrots screeching, a sound that burst into the air and wove itself into the wind, echoing from the cliffs, multiplying into a scream of 1,000 birds. Sabriel stilled the bell at once and put it away, but the echoes raced across the valley, and she knew the thing behind her had heard. She felt it fix its attention on where she was, and she felt it quickening its pace, like watching the muscles on a racehorse going from a walk to a gallop. It was coming up the steps, at least 4 or 5 at a time. She felt no rush for it in her head, and the fear rising in her at equal pace. But she still went to the path and looked down, drawing her sword as she did so. There, between gusts of snow, she saw a figure leaping from step to step, impossible leaps that ate up the distance between them with horrible appetite. It was man-like, more than man-high, and flames ran like burning oil on water where it trode. Sabriel cried out as she saw it, and felt the dead spirit within. The book of the dead opened to frightful pages in her memory, and descriptions of evil poured into her head. It was a mordicant that hunted her, a thing that could pass at will through life and death. Its body of bog clay and human blood molded and infused with free magic by a necromancer, and a dead spirit placed inside as its guiding force. Sabriel had banished a mordicant once, but that had been 40 miles from the wall in Ancelstier, and it had been weak, already fading. This one was strong, fiery, newborn. It would kill her, and she suddenly knew, and subjugate her spirit. All her plans and dreams, her hopes and courage, fell out of her to be replaced by pure, unthinking panic. She turned to one side, then the other, like a rabbit running from a dog, but the only way down was the path, and the mordicant was only a hundred yards below, closing with every blink. With every falling snowflake, flames were spewing from its mouth, and it thrust its pointed head back and howled as it ran, a howl like the last shout of someone falling to their death, underlaid with the squeal of fingernails on glass. Sabriel, a scream somehow stuck and clogging in her throat, turning to the cliff, hammering on it with the pommel of her sword. "Open! Open!" she screamed, as charter marks raced through her brain. But not the right ones for forcing a door, a spell she learned in the second form. She knew it like she knew her timetables, but the charter marks just wouldn't come. And why was 12 times 12 sticking in her head when she wanted charter marks? The echoes of Sabriel faded, and in the silence the pommel struck on something that thudded hollowly. Rather than throwing sparks and jarring her hand, something wooden, something there that hadn't been there before. A door, tall, strangely narrow, its dark oak lined with silver charter marks dancing through the grain. An iron ring exactly at head height touched Sabriel's hip. Sabriel dropped her sword with a gasp, grabbed the ring, and pulled. Nothing happened. Sabriel tugged again, half turning to look over her shoulder, almost cringing at what she would see. The mordicant turned the last corner, and its eyes met hers. Sabriel shut them, unable to bear the hatred and bloodlust glowing in its gaze like a poker left too long in the forge. It howled again and almost flowed up the remaining steps, flames dripping from its mouth, claws, and feet. Sabriel's eyes, still closed, pushing on the ring. The door flew open, and she fell in, crashing to the ground in a flurry of snow, eyes snapping open. Desperately, she twisted herself around on the ground, ignoring the pain in her knees and hands. Reaching back outside, she snagged the hilt of the sword and snatched it in. As the blade cleared the doorway, the mordicant reached in and, twisting itself sideways, to pass the narrow portal, thrust an arm inside. Flames boiled from its gray-green flesh like beads of sweat, and small fumes of black smoke spiraled from the flames, bringing with them a stench like burning hair. Sabriel sprawled defenseless on the floor, and could only stare in terror as the thing's four-taloned hand slowly opened up and reached out for her.